that can be very upsetting when you're not able to deliver the care that you would like, and that in a way that it is very jarring to what your beliefs are and your values, and you still have to go in every day and do the deliver the service the way the system dictates it should be done. So here we just have how a lot of these concepts relate to one another. Compassion and satisfaction, again, is when we come in and we have that desire to have compassion for people, to have empathy. And so once that starts trickling down and we're low on that, that's when you start to see that we become more susceptible to compassion fatigue, and that then can result in burnout and or vicarious trauma. So even though they're kind of different, it is possible to experience these at the same time. So some risk factors and who can experience burnout, the type of work that we do can set us up for burnout. So burnout is very common, again, in healthcare settings, in helping professions, when people dedicate a lot of their resources to helping other people. And even within that and out of that, people who have administrative duties or responsibilities, who are kind of at management level, tend to be at risk for burnout more than other people within employment systems. If you are highly identified with your professional identity, so your job, your profession is a big part of who you are, there is a likelihood for burnout as well. Because once work starts to become stressful, then you kind of internalize that as part of who you are. If you have challenges balancing your personal and professional lives, so as we saw there in the clip from This Is Us, you know, we have Randall supposed to go see his brother act in this play, and that would be his personal life, and he calls him to cancel. So again, challenges in being able to balance what's important to you outside of your job and what's important to you in your job. Feeling like you have no control at work is a huge risk factor for burnout, because there are many things that you'd like to change or that you're not happy with, but if you feel that you don't have control over it, it leads to a feeling of being stuck. Of course, being overworked, and not just overworked, but if your job is very monotonous and there isn't diversity in responsibilities or what you can do, that can also lead up to some burnout. We have low social support, so feeling like you don't have people at work that you can chat with, that you can go to when you need, as well as if there's little flexibility to adjust your needs. Let's say you need to figure out childcare, you have someone sick at home that you need to care for. If your job doesn't give you the flexibility to adjust to those things, it's highly likely that it could lead to burnout. Again, conflicting values, like I was talking about in moral injury. If the system that you work with stands for one thing and it's not in line with what you stand for, that could lead to a lot of internal conflict and dissatisfaction with your work. Challenging dynamics. So we spend so much time at work, and so it would be nice to somewhat enjoy who we work with, and if we don't get along with people, that can also contribute to some of the burnout that happens at work, as well as unclear expectations. So not knowing what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it, and having it switch up on you numerous times can be very frustrating to navigate. So some of the consequences, and that's why I showed that video clip, because I think that clip really, it hits home, and I think that it does a great job at embodying what some of the consequences are in a very short amount of, in a small time frame. So we have physical symptoms, and physical symptoms can manifest themselves in medical ways. People who suffer from burnout, it's very common for them to also have medical conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes, body pain, muscle twitches, things like that. And then we have the emotional symptoms that we saw on the clip. So just that feeling of anxiety. We saw, Randall struggling to breathe, he was shaking, he was crying. So you start to see symptoms that start to drift off into the realm of, sadness, anxiety. It's important to highlight, which I do at the bottom of this slide, that burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, none of these are mental health illnesses. They're not disorders. They're not found in our diagnostic statistics manual. And they do have symptoms pretty often that kind of resemble some of these conditions. You'll see some behavioral changes as well. So as I had mentioned earlier, things like maybe just not caring and showing up late to work, not being able to manage your nutrition correctly. Let's say you had an exercise routine down and now you don't really do that anymore. As we saw in the clip, again, as I had mentioned, canceling on family members for important occasions. And then the other outcomes that we see are decreased performance at work, that just the quality of the work that you're doing is not up to par, and it doesn't compare to how you started out. It's also very common to see interpersonal difficulties. If you think about it, it relates back to the physical and emotional symptoms. So that irritability that sometimes also comes through with burnout will have an impact in your interpersonal relationships, and not just at work, outside of work, so in your personal life as well. And then, as we had mentioned before, this all then results in a diminished care for the clients that we are serving. So now we can go into HIV work a little bit more. So as Karen mentioned, I do work with families who are affected by HIV. And so some of the things that I'm sure you all know, and that I know as well, is that the work that we do in HIV is very complex. And so I am coming actually from the behavioral health end of how do you then connect behavioral health with the medical health piece, when the medical health piece takes up so much resources, and then also trying to drive home the importance of mental health. So it becomes very complex, a lot of people involved, a lot of services, resources. So that makes it particularly challenging. I think the other thing about the work in HIV for us to keep in mind is the intersectionality of social determinants. And so that often in HIV, we see a lot of these different social identities merge, and that becomes a part of the work that we're doing, which increases the level of stress in the cases, and then the level of services that we have to integrate, therefore making the care more complex. So things like intersecting poverty with racism, along with the lack of social supports, you put that all together in one case, and then you have a lot of those cases that now the level of complexity has increased significantly. And then when we look at treatments, ARVs have changed the course of the illness, so people now are living longer, which is great news. And what that means is living longer means managing this condition for longer, which means more services, again, more efforts to helping people be able to manage their illness throughout this time. And so that leads into this idea that there's a longer lifespan and how that affects the work that we do. And again, because there is a longer lifespan now, and there is so much contact that is required between the provider and the patient, the relationship in HIV between providers, regardless of what type of service is being given, but the relationship between the provider and the patient is so much more different than in other illnesses. So it's a closer relationship, which then again brings its own implications when it comes to our own well-being and burnout. So for wraparound services, we need wraparound services often to address this complexity, because there is so much happening. We need to involve more people. And at the same time, there's not enough funding to do this. So what winds up happening is people don't get the level of compensation they would like for the kind of work that they do. So then we have that high turnover that we had talked about. But then we have also a high workload for some people, which again then contributes to burnout. So we don't have enough financial funding, and then the funding that we do have usually goes to the medical needs rather than the behavioral health or other services. And so again, this leads to more stress. So it's a bit of a setup when it comes to HIV work. And so all the things that I kind of went over to review, illustrate how there is a predisposition for burnout and work-related stress when you're doing work within HIV positive populations. And so there's a variety of stressors within the work that we do that can contribute to that burnout and even compassion fatigue. And the last point to highlight is that a lot of within the HIV population, it's very common to see trauma. Trauma is very salient. And so again, how does that affect the people that are working with these populations? So some of the stressors for service providers, for HIV service providers, we have increase in demands. Paperwork is probably the biggest one when it comes to HIV service providers. So much of the work that we do is dependent on grants, and grants want paperwork in exchange for money. So that's a pretty big one, and it takes a lot of time to complete that paperwork. Isolation is another stressor. There are not a lot of people who do this kind of work. And there is a lot of stigma that comes, that is related to doing this kind of work. So it's not, sometimes people receive certain reactions when they say they do this kind of work. And so again, identity, right? Work is so much part of what we do. What does that do for us if we don't have the natural supports embedded when it comes in the work that we do? Grief, as I mentioned earlier, it's great that our patients are living longer, and loss and death still occur due to AIDS complications. And so again, related to trauma, what can that be like for providers to have to experience grief on a more frequent basis when it comes to their work than other people? And then lastly, another stressor potentially is over-identification. So a lot of people who enter this work often enter because they have a close relationship to HIV or AIDS, and it's near and dear to their heart. So sometimes when that happens, we might over-identify with our clients. And again, what is our level of investment, that empathy, again, that connection, and how we might get drained and wind up in burnout, compassion fatigue mode. So again, some of the consequences more in the realm of HIV work, we have that emotional exhaustion. So for example, we might blame our patients for their current status, for being HIV positive maybe, or for them being ill. It's their fault. They're not following through with their care. They missed that appointment. They didn't refill their meds. Or we might even have a very cynical sense of humor, for example, in relation to how our patients are living their lives. There might be a feeling of powerlessness, and maybe not so much so HIV, but with STDs, this cycle of reinfection that might happen at times, as well as having a lot of patients not adhere to treatment on an ongoing basis and feeling like there's nothing that we can do about it other than just kind of sit back and watch, which then refers back to this idea of HIV and its chronicity, that it's not a one-time thing. There's no cure. It's just something that has to continuously be managed. Another consequence would be dissatisfaction. So very often, as I was mentioning before, the money just isn't there. So the wages can be low, and the opportunities for promotions might not be there as well. So often people might wind up dissatisfied with their work. And then there's always uncertainty. As we've seen changes in the political climate, the government, where money is allocated, it's because HIV work relies so much on grants and federal funds and things like that. it's uncertain money at times. And so people might, that might affect how they feel about their work. So how do we manage burnout? So there are different ways to start to address the managing of burnout. And so if we think about it, there are two levels. So there's what can your organization do or your job, and then what can you do? And then somewhere in between, where is that transaction between the two? So the first one, we can modify the structures of the organization and the job processes. So that's something that is recommended and that should be looked at and addressed. And we know that change from the top will always take a lot longer than change from the bottom. So while that's something to be considered, we also then encourage the bottom-up approach because it will take more time to change an entire system and organization. And so from the bottom up, what we can do is individual actions for stress reduction. So things that we can do to manage our own well-being and our stress levels at work. In between, what we want, right, is some harmony that exists between the provider and the worker. And so very often, I think an in-between is different professional development programs that can be developed to try to have that going. So how to combat burnout. So this would be more kind of that in-between. Some suggestions that have been made are doing things like talks, so like this, like a webinar, conferences, retreats for your staff without, and the key here is without having your staff having to request PTO, right? That this shouldn't be taken out of their personal time, but that it's actually a work initiative for them to take care of themselves. Also having on hand resources for them, books, websites, experts that you are able to pull from for then your staff to feel supported. And then from the top up, things that we can do are having formal policies that acknowledge and say these stressors are real, they happen, and let's try to have some sort of mechanisms by which we monitor the level of stress. Lastly, it's all about culture, what kind of culture there is at your job. And if so, if there can be a culture to encourage everybody to care for themselves, that first we have to do that in order to care for others, that's also always helpful. So things to consider when we want to decrease stress and energy drain. So this would be more for ourselves on an individual level. So mindfulness, kind of that very first activity that I showed with the music, the Hakuna Matata. Mindfulness you can do with anything. You can do with music. You can, there are plenty of mindfulness apps now that you can download and have on your phone. And you don't even have to think about what can I do for mindfulness. It'll tell you. And you kind of just follow it. But mindfulness can be as simple as eating. Like if you have a snack and you have a cookie, just take your 5 minutes to just eat your cookie. Not eat a cookie and send an email and talk to somebody on the phone at the same time. That's not mindfulness. So those are some of the things that we suggest. Journaling can help with self-awareness. So even if it's just to jot down how a particular interaction went, how you felt about it, what you thought about it, it brings more self-awareness. And so the more connected you are to yourself and your experience, the more that you can catch the burnout earlier rather than when it's already kind of consumed you and there isn't much to do. Reward your wins. So kind of the smallest things that we can achieve, even if it is sending an email that we were dreading, rewarding yourself for that. Delegating is super important. So understanding that you can't do everything, and that it's okay not to have it all be on your shoulders, and to be able to find people to have do different tasks. You can, other things to decrease the stress, develop a system for yourselves as far as organization goes. When, what type of documentation are you prioritizing? What's going to be your time management? How do you, do you prioritize emails over phone calls? And then what's your vision? What do you see for yourself? So I think here we're referring to, some people even have like a vision board. And this is where I'm at, and this is what I'm aiming for. And often, even if it's a visual that you have in your office, that helps to kind of keep you centered on overall where are you trying to go. A lot of the things here are not just employment specific. So as I'm going into the second column, you'll see even things like understanding your personal finances. How does that decrease the stress? Well, if you know what your finances are, right, you won't be as, you know what's realistic when it comes to worries about your wages and your employment, et cetera, and whether you can afford to leave your job or not. But you can't make those decisions in an efficient way if you don't really understand your personal finances. And then the last two, again, taking care of your relationships and scheduling your weeks. So that goes into more of the personal piece, which is what I'm going to go into now, of how burnout is not just about what is happening at work, but also what's happening outside of work. So what's your personal recharge? This first one I find to be a really great recommendation of creating some sort of boundary ritual between work and home to help you shut off. So that might mean the moment you get home, you take a shower. It's kind of creating that space between work and your house so that the two don't blur into each other. Again, being able to say no to things that you know you can't do. And then some of the other things are more about how do we take care of our body and our mind. So exercising, hobbies, having time for relationships, being spontaneous, going on vacations, or having some sort of big plan, and then your nutrition. So I'll go into work-life balance, which I will acknowledge I think is difficult for most of us. And it's important to figure out what that is for each and every one of us. So first it takes acknowledging what is stressful to you when it comes to your job. And then secondly, we want to be able to recognize what are your limits. So not only your professional limits, but also personally, where are your limits? So some examples you might want to look into are your schedule. So what does your schedule at work look like? And being asked to stay, do overtime, or come in early, can you do that? And again, being able to say no if that's not within your limits. Delegating, we had mentioned before, and within that boundary that I talked about, the ritual boundary of being able to leave your work at work. To maintain this balance, we recommend the use of supervision. And even having supervision can be challenging. So if there is opportunity for that, to make that opportunity and to use it. And then prioritizing what's important or fun in our lives. So different people have different priorities. So it might be spending time with your family. It might be spending time alone. It might be spending time with some sort of spiritual congregation. Whatever it is for you, make sure that you have space for that. This is a very quick acronym that can help us take care of ourselves. So this comes from dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. This is one of the skills that we usually teach in that treatment. And so it's a very easy to remember acronym, ABC, please, and kind of goes over what each one of those means. So A, accumulate positive experiences. We want to have as much positive in our lives. So again, those big plans, vacations, or remodeling your home, whatever it might be that's positive for you, having as much of that possible, because things won't always be positive and at work, right? So we want to be able to draw from those past experiences what's positive so that we can kind of have it as a reserve. B, build mastery. So finding something that you're really good at and becoming even better at it. And that could be at work or that could be in your personal life. So if you want to be a runner and you've been running, just getting really good at running, for example. C, coping ahead. So I find this to be the most one of the most helpful. And again, in scheduling your weeks, your days, knowing what's going to happen that might cause a lot of stress for you, and be able to cope ahead. Have a plan for that particular day ahead of time. And then the please really refers to our body, because our body connects a lot with our mind. And if our body isn't right, our mind isn't right, and vice versa. So the P and the L, physical illness, if you're sick, you have to make sure that you treat it. We tell this to our patients, right? They need to take care of their HIV. We need to do the same. You know, if we have a cold, if we have the flu, if we have a stomach virus, really trying to make sure that we treat it, that we take care of ourselves. Eating balanced meals. So we know, and there's a lot more research coming out these days on the impact of what we put into our bodies, how it actually affects our minds and well-being. We want to avoid mood-altering drugs and substances. So very often when I do this presentation, we joke, it's not uncommon for somebody to go home after a long day and have a glass of wine, a beer, and that's understandable. And so what we want to do is avoiding overdoing it, and things that, and even on a frequent basis, right? Because it also does have an impact on your mood and your functioning. We want to get enough sleep, so that would be 7 to 8. I saw an article yesterday that actually says 7 to 10 hours of sleep for adults. And then lastly, exercise, whatever that might be for you, a walk around the neighborhood or something more intense, a soul cycle class, but definitely getting that in. One of the things we also touch on when we're talking about burnout is, so I had mentioned before, burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, they are not mental health illnesses. And there are moments where for some people, burnout starts to merge and become more psychiatric. So it becomes depression, it becomes an anxiety disorder. And so once we've entered that area is where we really encourage that people, again, take care of themselves and seek the support that is needed for that. So being able, most of the time it would be recommended is some version of therapy. When we're in that area of depression and anxiety, it's not uncommon to have thoughts about suicide or to engage in substance abuse. So one of the things that we always recommend is that organizations have something, some sort of protocol where they, one, can recognize the symptoms of people who might be thinking about suicide or who might be abusing substances, and having then a protocol to refer them to the services that they might benefit from in a supportive way. How do we create environments that are non-judgmental and that really, at the end of the day, thinking about the notion that we only have each other's back. And so we really should be looking out for each other and making sure that we're taken care of. And that if we're struggling and that if we're in pain, that, you know, our work where we spend so much of our time can also support us and make sure that we are connected and supported. So lastly, one of the things that we also recommend is coming up with an action plan. Usually during this talk, I have people really think about what will my plan be? So for example, people identify what their area of burnout might be. And so when it comes to HIV work, it might be the client behaviors that are really burning you out. So things like reinfection or risky sex or non-adherence. Or it might be the workload. There's too much paperwork. I'm doing too much case management. I have to track these patients, find them. Or lastly, it just might be the isolation of the work that might be contributing to the burnout. So maybe I'm out in the field by myself, looking for some of the clients, and I spend so much time alone. So once I've identified my area of burnout, then I want to identify a goal. And then lastly, a small step in moving towards that goal. So I have an example. So for example, for an action plan, we can have my area of burnout might be my workload. And this has happened to us in our clinic before. Things like all of a sudden the grant that you have is requiring a new document that you have to complete with all of your clients. on your caseload by the end of, let's say, like next week. So usually that would put a lot of stress on certain people if you're already doing a certain amount of documentation and other responsibilities. So what would my goal be? So maybe I'm thinking I have too much work to do. I feel so overwhelmed. Nobody understands me. This is why I keep snapping at them. So my goal in that case might be I want to decrease my irritability, or I want to have healthier communication with my colleagues. So what are some small steps I could take? So just thinking about everything that we've gone over when it comes to managing burnout, it might be I might decide I'm going to play some music in my office space, or maybe I'm going to create a do not disturb sign for a certain amount of time during the day where people cannot come find me and I can focus on my documentation. Or maybe I'll do something preemptive, so coping ahead, and I'll schedule check-ins with people first. That way they don't come to me and they don't find me or interrupt me. I get that out of the way and then I can go back to my documentation. Or maybe I could do something with that communication piece and feeling better about my work. I could schedule in a 5-minute coffee break and just use that time to chat with my coworkers. So that's all for today. We can do questions.
Yes. If anybody has questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask verbally, or if you want to put them in the chat box, I will monitor that as well in case anything comes in, questions or comments.
I had put something in the chat box a while ago. I just wondered if anybody's read a really good book or found any other kind of great resource that really helped them with, like either a potential burnout situation or something that they wanted to work on to make sure that they didn't get there, if they had any recommendations about that. So if we have a few resources that we would want to recommend in addition to what Maciel has on the screen for us, is that something that you guys would be interested to see? Like maybe we could bring it to the next learning session?
Yeah, I would definitely be interested in seeing it. I can't think of anything right now. A lot of the things that come to mind are little blurbs and pieces from Facebook and, other things like that. So it'd be really cool to have something that's a little bit more concrete, and other resources to sink our teeth into. Okay.
Yeah, I've seen some books and sometimes they're set up like sort of daily reminders, like, what's one thing I did today that really clearly helped someone, just so you're reinforcing like the reasons that you're doing this work to begin with, or one thing that you're really grateful for, just to remind yourself of, the good stuff that you have going on, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I've seen in books.
I think on that point, Karen, I remember I had a patient who, I can't remember the name of the app, but I know there's a lot of apps too where you can draw. I think this was more a faith-based app that she had, but it was like a Jesus saying per day that she would get, and that would kind of inspire her to do what she needed to do for the day. So I think often in apps too, now that we're so technologically advanced, even doing this webinar, we can take advantage of things through having your phone.
Yeah, we never leave these, so exactly. That might be helpful. And I think it's Maciel Guzman, right? Is that your first name, Maciel? You suggested guided imagery on YouTube is good for de-stressing. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah, I use Calm.
What was that, Maciel?
The app I have on my phone is called Calm. And they have, so you can make a purchase and buy to unlock things, but you also can use unlocked versions of it that are free.
Mm-hmm.
I like that idea, and kind of mixing that with what Dottie had said about accountability. I'm thinking about what Adam had said, that at Jefferson, they're integrating breathing routines as a part of morning huddle. And if, kind of thinking about how we as a team are all, practicing mindfulness and wellness, and that kind of caretaking is a way to bring that to the team level and to have that accountability. And it's not a finger wagging accountability, it's like a hug.
Yeah.
And we did try a little aromatherapy at the last learning session, and Dottie was writing in lavender and lemongrass in a diffuser. That's a really good prescription.
I have a giant lavender one that like blows at all times in my apartment.
That must be great.
Uh-huh.
Oh, wow. And Gracine just put in the chat that NJCRI has a fitness room where they have a small gym for staff and clients alike, and they have yoga every Monday, which is really cool.
I like that too.
I want to take advantage of that.
We used to do that at Whitman Walker. There was a wellness, kind of like a yoga thing that was in the day center, like the intensive outpatient area. So all of those folks would go home, and then that was a place where there was lots of space where, bring their mats. Mm-hmm. And some of them were open to just staff, and then others were also open to volunteers and other patients who get involved too, to kind of further that, development of trust and like, I don't know, family feel.
Mm-hmm. And Gracine, what you wrote in the chat box, is that something they do together as a staff every year? They all do the AIDS walk together?
I got a chat from Miss Flowers. So if you wanted to unmute your phone or your computer and let everyone know.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, so yeah, we're all preparing for our annual AIDS walk on Cinco de Mayo. All the staff is going to be participating, and we've been seeking out sponsors and all of that, and it's going to be a great day.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. I really love that so many corporations, use AIDS walk and, rides and runs and stuff like that as a way to pull people together. Like, we're all so passionate about this. That's why we're in the field and we get out of bed every day and come into the office. So, kind of sharing in that, and having like communion over, our shared passion, I think is like another really great idea. It's just a reminder.
Yeah.
I think another thing that's really cool, going another way, slightly that's a little bit more conversation oriented, a lot of the morale building and kind of staff experience consultants do a lot of kind of grounding work around, what drives us as individuals, to try to just have that conversation at all, like around the table. Like, so, let's learn about ourselves. Like, why have we come here? What does interest me? What does drive me? What shuts me down? And that's kind of another thing that, builds on what Dottie had mentioned.
I think related to that, it's really interesting. You can also do, and they're free, personality inventories that I think would tap into. And I think people have a fun time because they're like BuzzFeed questionnaires almost.
Yeah.
So people have a fun time answering those questions and learning more about who they are and kind of like, this is who I am as a person. And I think taps into some of, how do we then bring that back to our jobs, and where am I lacking? What do I need? And then where am I feeling satisfied?
Yeah. I love, yeah. Because even things that sometimes feel flippant, well, that's what we need. Like we're talking all day about people who have really severe problems. So it's kind of cute to take a minute to be like, I'm Carrie Bradshaw. Who are you?
Right.
We're all Carrie Bradshaw. That's funny. Well, I just wanted to say thank you to Maciel for presenting the information that you gave us today and the great ideas for sort of how to think through how to take care of ourselves and how to figure out how to make an impact on our care systems so that they're a little more friendly to our own needs. so that we can better serve the clients. So we can have, follow-up conversations about this. If there's something else that you would like to see that's related to this topic, or some practicing of some of the things that were suggested, you can let your coach know about that, and we'd be happy to figure that out with you. And I'll turn it back over to Greg.
Yeah. So everybody that was in the webinar today, if you haven't already, I will hang out for a couple minutes. If you could put your name and agency in the chat box so that I can account for your being present. And then I will send an email out to everybody that was on the webinar today so that we can get some feedback to inform future webinars as well. So go ahead if you haven't already. I know there were a few people that haven't put their name in there. But thank you for coming. And if you have questions, reach out to your coaches, reach out to me, and we can get those addressed for you. But other than that, have a good day.
Thank you.
Sure. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Thanks. And did anybody else have any questions? I see some people still logged in. All right. Yes, if you can hear me, I will be posting the the slides from the PowerPoint and the recording up on Basecamp. If you have any specific questions, you could reach out to your coach, who I believe is Dottie. But then if you want to put, I'm not sure if I have you in Basecamp, put your email in the chat box for me, and I can get the registration link sent out to you so you can access all the resources that way.